I'm James Myers, and I welcome you to another episode of Plato's Pod. It's good to be back after a longer than planned break for the summer and a much needed rest after more than 70 episodes of this podcast. And this time, Plato scholar Michael Fitzpatrick and I bring Plato into the 21st century by talking about a modern Platonist, Alain Badiou, whose thinking and political philosophy that we discuss relate in many ways to Plato's works. We touch on the Republic and the Gorgias in particular in the course of discussing Badiou's core message to think the event. I hope you enjoy exploring the ideas in our dialogue as much as I did. Well, welcome back, Michael. It's great to have you here and to talk about a modern Platonist today.
Thanks, James. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I understand that there's connections with this particular quote here, and so we wanted to talk about bringing Plato into modern philosophy and the effects that he's had on modern philosophers. And so we're going to talk today about Alain Badiou. But there's a quote here that I thought we could start with, and this is from the Republic 499b. And the quote is, nonetheless, we were compelled by the truth to say that no city, constitution, or individual man will ever become perfect until either some chance event compels those few philosophers who aren't vicious, that is, the ones who are now called useless, to take charge of a city, whether they want to or not, and compels the city to obey them, or until a god inspires the present rulers and kings or their offspring with a true erotic love for true philosophy. So let's start with that, and maybe if you can just tell us how that relates to Alain Badiou and tell us about his background, and we'll read a few of his excerpts.
Wonderful. Thank you, James. So, one way to understand Alain Badiou is he's a philosopher of events. Alain Badiou is a French philosopher, so he comes from a different background than those of us who live in North America. And he has really been shaped by a formative occurrence that happened in his youth, and that was the student revolts that took place in France in May of 1968 and elsewhere around Europe and in the United States and other places. But Badiou was a young man who experienced that agitation of the youth and the masses firsthand, and it formed him, it shaped him. And so he spent essentially the rest of his career trying to understand why that had such an formative effect on his life and what he should do about it as a philosopher. Alain Badiou is still alive today. He's in his mid 80s, and he has been probably the leading French philosopher of the last 40 years, especially since the 90s when his work started getting translated into English. And we're going to read a couple of his English translation selections in our discussion today. In the passage that you read, James, Plato makes a comment that this passage is representative of, but it's something that is sprinkled throughout his writings, especially his political writings. And that is that he says that you're not going to have a just society until by some chance event there's a coincidence between philosophy and power. And later in that passage, he says that there won't be justice until a God inspires the present rulers and kings. So I want to kind of talk a little bit about those two phrases and how they relate to Alain Badiou. So Badiou is somebody who looked at this passage and similar passages in Plato's writings and thought, what Plato here means by an event is something more than just something happened, an occurrence. He means that a specific kind of thing took place. And for Badiou, that's going to be an occurrence that is transformative, where something that was deemed impossible, given what people knew at the time and given the way things were, took place. And out of that improbability emerged a new way of being, a new way of looking at things, something transformative. And Badiou is going to call this thing that emerges a truth. So he's going to say, whenever an event takes place, a truth emerges, and that truth sort of presents itself to us as humans of whether we're going to take up that truth and live by it, or we're going to react against it and resist it. And Badiou's word truth there is really his updating or his alternative to Plato's word form. And we're going to see that a little bit in some of these writings. So when Plato's talking about the forms, these objective eternal realities, that's what Badiou has in mind when he talks about a truth. So I mentioned May 1968 student riots in France as an example of an event. It's important to understand that events are not just any old occurrence. The way you know you're in an event is because it's transforming the way you look at the world. There's some debate, obviously, over what the events are, but one that you and I can use for some of the purposes of this discussion, James, is that the death of Socrates was an event in the life of Plato and the other students of Socrates. So it's not just that Socrates dies, people die all the time. It's that the manner of his death, his public trial, his unwillingness to escape from prison, his equanimity in the face of dying, those things changed the way Plato looked at the world and changed the way that he lived his life. So, for listeners trying to get their head around what do we mean by an event, use Socrates' death as a kind of paradigm of what we mean. Two other things I want to say, and then I'll wrap up so we can turn to our first reading. The first thing I want to say is what Badiou is most famous for is theorizing the kinds of truths that can emerge from an event. He comes up with a classification of four. There might be others, so this is not necessarily intended to be a decisive list, although I think Badiou thinks these are the only four kinds. He thinks that one type of truth are political truths. That should be unsurprising since the passage we just read from Plato is from the Republic. It's about politics. But he also thinks there are scientific truths. So when Einstein undertakes a transformation of how we think about space-time from the Newtonian paradigm to the Minkowski space-time paradigm, Badiou wants to say that's a kind of an event. Maybe we'll locate it with some of the experiments that were taking place at the time, or maybe with the 1905 inaugural paper that Einstein published. But something took place there that changed the way Einstein and his collaborators understood the theories of physics that they were working with. The third type of truth that can emerge from an event is an artistic truth. Badiou is a published playwright. He's super into the arts. We'll see some of that a little bit later, that he's really interested in the ways that art can change the way we look at things. And then finally, he thinks that love is an event. This is probably one of his most interesting ideas, that he thinks when you fall in love with someone, that you are experiencing an event, that there's a sense in which you are freely choosing to love this person, and yet if it's true love, you almost can't help yourself. And it's because encountering that person has changed the way you look at the world, and now you can't imagine life without them. Obviously, there are other possibilities. I myself am a Christian, so I think that there are such a thing as religious events. And the only reason I mention that is because I think Plato does too, since in the second half of this quote, he says that one way an event can come about is a God inspires the present rulers and kings. And I just want to be upfront with people. Badiou is an atheist, although he's a very interesting atheist because he thinks of events as happening kind of like miracles. That is, an event is something that everybody's beliefs and the reigning power say this is impossible, and then an event happens and makes the impossible possible. And Badiou sort of thinks, yeah, that's kind of like how religious people talk about miracles. So there is this kind of interesting way in which Badiou is very willing to take up religious language and is very appreciative of the kind of religious language that is evident here in Plato. So I just put that out there for people to sort of think about other possible types of truths that can emerge from an event than the ones we'll see Alain Badiou talk about.
Well, thank you. That's a really good introduction. So, event, I'm getting the sense is some sort of a revolution in thought, some change in paradigm, I guess, of one's thinking.
Yeah, so he thinks it's not just that it changes the way you think, it actually changes the way you and your fellow collaborators are going to orient yourselves relative to the world.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And it's also interesting that you say that he's an atheist, which maybe we'll get a chance to talk today about that kind of difference between him and Plato, because I think, yeah, as you mentioned, it's Plato has a different view, I guess, of the universe and the soul, I guess. So that'd be interesting to talk about if we come across it. I just wanted to ask, maybe before I go into the first reading, was Badiou influenced by any other Neoplatonists, or how did he get along the Platonic path or track?
That's a really good question, and one I don't know the answer to. His intellectual development is pretty circuitous. But as we'll see in this first reading, I think his orientation towards Plato actually comes in reaction to the people that he's in dialogue with. So, in a lot of French philosophy and even some German philosophy in the latter half of the 20th century, there was this kind of strong revolt against a belief that there are truths and a tendency towards thinking in terms of cultures and identities and sort of material realities and so on. And so Badiou more and more found himself in a strong set of skepticism against the prevailing attitudes that he was seeing in the academy in his day. And I think that's what led him to a reappreciation of the importance of Plato's orientation to believing that our political activities, our artistic activities, our scientific activities, and even our love lives are beholden to something greater than ourselves. And when he first started writing, this first reading you're going to offer is from his book called Manifesto for Philosophy. And the reason he wrote a manifesto was kind of as a lone voice in the wilderness reacting against the dominant attitudes that he saw in the academy at the time and this kind of desire as a radical to resurrect Plato to help make his case in the 20th century. So I would call Badiou a Neoplatonist, and all I mean by that is he is absolutely somebody working in the Platonic tradition, but as you just alluded to, he has made his own adjustments, and everybody reworks their teachers for their own ends. And so he is not word for word a follower of Plato, but he has made use of Plato, I think, in some really interesting ways.
Hmm. Yeah, and we'll explore that. And again, we can talk about differences and similarities. I guess it's interesting though to see in this part that I'm about to read, he really attacks another philosopher. So yeah, why don't we get into it then? So this, as you said, is this is from Manifesto for Philosophy, and it's a chapter called Platonic Gesture, and we'll pick up in the second paragraph of that chapter. So I'll just go ahead and read this. An anti-sophistic configuration of the matheme as inaugural, the poem as dismissed, the political as founded again, and love as thought, the philosophical gesture I propose is a Platonic one. The century till now has been anti-Platonic. I do not know of a theme more widespread in the most varied and divided philosophic schools than anti-Platonism. Under the heading Plato in the Philosophy Dictionary commissioned by Stalin, we could read, quote, ideologue of the slave owners, unquote, which was short and blunt. But Sartrean existentialism in its polemic against essences had Plato as its target. But Heidegger dates the beginning of oblivion from the Platonic turning, whatever his respect may be for what there still is of Greek in the luminous cutting up of the form. But contemporary philosophy of language takes the side of the sophists against Plato. But the thinking of human rights traces the totalitarian temptation back to Plato. This is notably Popper's inspiration. But Labarthe seeks to ferret out in the ambiguous relation of Plato to mimesis the origin of the destiny of the political in the West. There is no end to enumerating all the anti-Platonic sequences, all the grievances, all the deconstructions in which Plato is at stake. The great inventor of contemporary anti-Platonism at the dawn of the suture of philosophy to the poem, and because Platonism was the main ban on such a suture, was Nietzsche. The diagnosis Nietzsche established in the preface to Beyond Good and Evil is well known. Quote, "Indeed, as a physician, one might ask, how could the most beautiful growth of antiquity, Plato, contract such a disease?" Unquote. Plato is the name of the spiritual disease of the West. Christianity itself is nothing but a, quote, Platonism for the use of the people, unquote. But what fills Nietzsche with elation, what finally gives free rein to free spirits, is that the West is starting its convalescence. Quote, "Europe is breathing freely again after this nightmare," unquote. In actual fact, the superseding of Platonism is underway, and this current superseding gives forth an energy of thinking that is without precedent. Quote, "The fight against Plato has created a magnificent tension of the spirit in Europe, the likes of which has never yet existed on earth," unquote. The free, very free spirits, the good Europeans, hold in their hands the bow thus bent and possess the arrow, the task, and, who knows, the goal. We know that it would soon appear that this goal was, once the bloody, unnameable lie of its political assumption had dissipated, the pure and simple delivery of thought to the poem. Nietzsche's polemic against the, quote, Plato disease, the application point of European therapy, pertains to the concept of truth, the radical axiom from which, quote, free spirits, unquote, can ensure Platonism's wake, a wake that is the wakefulness of thought as well as its awakening, lies in the dismissal of truth. Quote, "The falseness of a judgment is for us not necessarily an objection to a judgment," unquote. Nietzsche ushers in a century given over to antagonism and to potency through this complete eradication of the reference to truth, held as a major symptom of the Plato disease. To be cured of Platonism is first and foremost to be cured of truth. And this cure would not be complete were it not itself accompanied by a resolute hatred of the matheme, held as a carapace in which the diseased weakness of the Platonist nests. Quote, "Or consider the hocus pocus of mathematical form with which Spinoza clad his philosophy in mail and mask to strike terror at the very outset into the heart of any assailant. How much personal timidity and vulnerability this masquerade of a sick hermit betrays," unquote. Philosophy, through aphorisms and fragments, poems and enigmas, metaphors and maxims, the whole Nietzschean style, which has had so many echoes in contemporary thought, roots itself in the dual exigencies of the destitution of truth and the dismissal of the matheme. As anti-Platonist till the end, Nietzsche subjects the matheme to the Plato reserves for the poem, that of a suspect weakness, a disease of thought, a masquerade. There is no doubt as to Nietzsche's enduring victory. It is true that the century has been cured of Platonism, and that in its most vigorous thinking it has been sutured to the poem, abandoning the matheme to the quibbling of the positivist suture. That a contrario proof is given to us by the following. The only great openly Platonic as well as modern thinking was Albert Lautmann's in the 1930s. This thinking is structured right through by mathematics. For a long time it was buried and unrecognized after the Nazis interrupted its course by murdering Lautmann. Today it is the only fulcrum we can discover in almost 100 years for the Platonic proposal the current moment requires of us, if we put aside the Platonizing spontaneity of many mathematicians, in particular Gödel and Cohn, and of course the Lacanian doctrine of truth. Everything happened as though the Nietzschean utterance had sealed, in the guise of the suture to the poem, the jointly anti-matheme and anti-truth destiny of a century. Today the Nietzschean diagnosis must be toppled. The century and Europe must imperatively be cured of anti-Platonism. Philosophy shall only exist insofar as it proposes, to match the needs of our times, a new step in the history of the category of truth. It is truth which is a new idea in Europe today. And as with Plato, as with Lautmann, the novelty of this idea is illuminated in the frequenting of mathematics. So that was the passage from the chapter. I guess maybe just a couple of things I wanted to cover in there just before we talk about it. He refers to the matheme, M-A-T-H-E-M-E, and suture. And maybe if you could just talk a little bit about the use of those words.
Yeah, so at the very beginning of the section you read, he listed off those four types of truths that I alluded to. Matheme is his shorthand for mathematics, which is his paradigm of scientific truth, which is very, very Platonic. So he doesn't think physics or biology are the most representative of the sciences, although they are, but it's mathematics that are going to be the paradigm of the sciences. And then the poem is his paradigm for art. So he's really in this passage talking about a way in which art has been pitted against mathematics as sort of stand-ins for sophistry being pitted against Platonism. And that as the poem subsumes the matheme, that means sophistry is overcoming Platonism. And then you asked about the suture. So this is a technical term that he gets from Lacanian studies. What he means by it is think of the actual metaphor here, right? A suture is you stitch two things together. So it's when philosophy gets tied to some other non-philosophical thing. So one of the sutures he talks about is positivism, which is this belief that the only quote unquote truths are empirical things, things that can be verified empirically. That if I can't see it, I won't believe it. And so when philosophy or the sciences get sutured to positivism, that leads to a kind of reductionist view of the world that obviously is going to be completely skeptical of anything like forms or truths.
Hmm.
And I just want to say one other thing. A lot of this is his response to Nietzsche, who is kind of the great anti-Platonist. And he quoted from the preface to Beyond Good and Evil. And I just wanted to say for listeners, if you're readers of my Substack, Plato for the Masses, it's actually that passage where I get the title of my Substack, Platonism for the Masses. That was the derogatory term that Nietzsche used for Christianity. So it's that same strain of thought that I'm pushing against in my work, and I see Badiou doing the same.
Interesting. And so I guess the appeal to mathematics is more an appeal to the realm of being in the Platonic sense, as that permanent realm. Mathematics is unchangeable, whereas physics and anything that's subject to empirical proof is all part of that realm of becoming, that ever-changing realm of becoming. And so he says that the idea of truth has been lost. What caused that? I mean, it wasn't just Nietzsche, right? It was a bunch of things, I guess. Where did it kind of turn where truth became subjective, I guess?
Yeah, I think the way Badiou, and I would share this, I think the way Badiou reads Nietzsche is more as a somebody diagnosing the age than initiating the age. And the specific phrase that he repeats over and over from Nietzsche to answer your question is this notion of the free spirits. He talks about Jean-Paul Sartre, the Sartrean dismissal of essences. Well, Sartre was another one of the great students of Nietzsche who sort of argues that we're not bound by any essence, we're not bound by anything outside of our own freedom, and therefore we can self-determine, we can become whatever we want. And in a way, that sounds like the kind of opening up of possibilities that I was referring to earlier when I talked about the event. But actually, Badiou sees this doctrine of the free spirits as antithetical to his Platonic gesture because there's a difference between freedom that comes from my own arbitrary agency versus freedom that comes by taking up the project of living for a truth. And it's that latter thing that Badiou sees in Plato and that he wants to argue for. So, following that line, then, I think that the kind of subjectivizing tendency you're talking about comes out of the Enlightenment project centuries earlier. So, with someone like John Locke, Locke is going to famously argue that we only have access to the empirical representation of the world. And he says, I'm sure there's some kind of substrata to the world behind our empirical representations, but that is the I know not what. And so in that move, he's cutting off our relationships with the empirical world from the metaphysical reality of being that underwrites it. So now we only have becoming, we don't have being. And then with his political philosophy, someone like John Locke understands that empirical world to be something that is available for our manipulation. So when you have a political system that is more interested in, say, the protection of property rather than persons, well, that means that everything that's my property is something that I can do whatever I want with. And the only role of the political system there is to ensure my freedom to do whatever I want with. And so that creates a relationship to both being and becoming, where it's about imposing my will on things, exerting my freedom, rather than surrendering myself to the truth that emerges from being and that underwrites becoming.
Mm. Yeah, and it takes me back to that quote that I read at the beginning from Republic 499b, where he talks about being compelled by the truth, and he talks about the connection to the Constitution. And, so there's an example where so many constitutions now across the world, so many national constitutions are under huge stress. I mean, I guess I don't know if Badiou wrote this particular piece in 1968, but certainly being informed by what happened in 1968 across the world. I mean, it was everywhere in the US and Canada, in Europe, this great upheaval. And now we're going through another sort of upheaval. And I don't know if is the Nietzschean view, I guess, if there's this free will to do whatever we want, that we will just go through these upheavals periodically. And I was going to ask too about virtue. I don't think we hear about virtue from Badiou in this particular reading, but maybe to contrast with Nietzsche, how would the two contrast in terms of the question of virtue and some sort of truth in virtue?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, one of the hallmarks of Badiou's Neoplatonism is he's using slightly different terminology so as to sort of bring Plato into the 20th and 21st century. And he did write a book called Ethics. And in that book, I don't think he uses the word virtue, but he talks about fidelity to a truth. And it's very, I think, analogous to what virtue ethics has traditionally taught, which is in Plato's work, there's this idea that your aim as a rational agent is to learn how to discern the good, the true, the good, and the beautiful. And that as you're discerning the form of the good, you're then looking for how the good either is or should be manifest in the world of becoming. The way Badiou is going to frame it is that when an event occurs, that is, when some kind of cataclysm takes place in which you can see a new set of possibilities, when you have that vision of the truth, it still falls to you to now live your life for that truth, to orient yourself around bringing that truth into being. So, an example of this might be one that Badiou talks about a lot is the vision of equality, which is a really radical vision when it emerges at different points in recent history. Because for most of human history, the assumption that some people deserve to be superior to others was just taken for granted. And so this new possibility of equality, it's not just that you now have an idea, it's that you have to change the way that you live and you have to advocate for this truth and try to build institutions and networks and collaborators that are going to help bring this truth into being. And so Badiou sees a life of virtue. Again, he never calls it that, but the way he's thinking about it is we're trying to bring the ideal, the truth, into material reality so that when we point to our material institutions and our material processes and our material lives, we can say that they are embodiments of that immaterial truth that emerged from the event. Notice how everything I described is very external. It's all this stuff happening around me and that I'm participating in. Whereas I think the Nietzschean legacy is sort of the opposite. It's that the things outside of me, those are the things that are trying to oppress me. They're trying to impose things on me. They're trying to make me conform to patterns of culture, to social expectations about who I should marry, how much money I should make, what defines success. And that real freedom is when I can throw all of those things off and be authentic to my own agency. Not even authentic to my own inner self, because for someone like Nietzsche or Sartre, there is no inner self. There's just your freedom. And so their ideal life is one where everything that you do is determined by nothing else than the fact of your own freedom. Now, I want to be clear here. There's a cleverness to this position because they are right that there are oppressive realities of societies. And I just want to really highlight for people that Badiou's theory of the event is about truths that emerge from an event to overthrow those oppressive realities. So you almost might think that the Nietzschean and the Platonic thinker both agree on the problems, but they radically disagree on the solution.
And you said earlier that, and we'll see in the next reading that we have, where Badiou separates philosophy from power. And I guess to the extent that the Nietzschean view is that you have to overcome these external threats or this external yoke on you, that you have to get as much power as you can to overcome that. And so maybe going back to the Republic, maybe that's a little bit like Thrasymachus in terms of, having power is just, and everybody then gets to define their own sense of justice and what they're going to do with their power, which, in a technological world such as we have today, it's really it's a bit it's dangerous, I think, that everybody is defining things often on the basis of uh, images on the wall, just to use that allegory of the cave analogy from the Republic, where we're looking at things and we're reacting to things, but we are not thinking about the permanence of these things and the permanence of our action. And it's just sort of action or reaction, maybe without any sort of anchor. So, I mean, Nietzsche is, I understand, quite popular now, and maybe it's because there are a lot of these external boundaries on us. Is that why? And how are the Platonists, other than Badiou, how are the Platonists now responding to that?
Yeah, those are great questions. Um, Before I answer those directly, I just want to highlight your excellent invocation of the allegory of the cave, because on Badiou's reading, the allegory of the cave is actually Plato's extended metaphor for an event. So if you remember, Plato does not tell a story of somebody who unshackles themselves and stands up and walks out of the cave. Instead, he tells a story of people who are forced to look at the shadows on the wall, and then somebody sets one of them free and drags them kicking and screaming out of the cave. And that's why this theory of the event or truth compelling, as you mentioned earlier, is so important, is that that allegory is sort of describing that an event is traumatic. It's disrupting your world. It's, throwing everything into uncertainty. And for a time, it's even painful. But after an event, that is, after you've left the cave and you've suddenly seen things in the light of the sun, you're changed. You can't act as if there's no sun now, so to speak. Now, you can be a reactionary, and Badiou has written extensively on this. You can self-delude yourself into believing that there is no sun and coming up with reasons to go back into the cave. So I want to be clear, it's not like this is some kind of automatic process. If everybody sees the light, then they'll be forever changed. It's not that easy,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Yeah.
And so I think the modern day popularity of Nietzsche is actually a kind of reflection of a reactionary attitude that because institutions that were responsible for shepherding real truths into the community became self-interested and abused their power, people have come to distrust all forms of authority. And as a result, they're looking for luminaries who are sort of justifying a practice of life that says, I am my own authority and I am the only authority. And Nietzsche is very useful for coming up with a justification for that. Now, Nietzsche is brilliant. Nietzsche is a beautiful writer. He's a really, really interesting thinker. So I do want to distinguish the real Nietzsche from what is probably the popular Nietzsche. Somebody who buys the quotable Nietzsche from a bookstore and builds their philosophy on that. But nonetheless, it is true that Nietzsche is defending a kind of, I wouldn't call it libertine lifestyle, but a kind of emancipated lifestyle from all external authorities. And so your last question was, what does Badiou or someone like Badiou recommend for this age? Well, what he's doing in this chapter, the Platonic gesture that follows in the rest of his manifesto, is this invocation that the role of philosophy today is to do a specific set of things. Number one, to defiantly declare that there are truths. And number two, to name them and identify them for others. So he has this kind of quixotic view that he doesn't think philosophy is actually in the business of itself producing truths. Rather, he thinks that philosophy is about going around to political events, um, amorous events, artistic events, and scientific events, and helping people to see them as events and to see the truths emerging from them. So it's a kind of midwife role, again, very Platonic, of sort of retraining people indoctrinated into this Nietzschean or Sartrean way of life to learn how to see truth once more. And that is the Platonic gesture.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting to think about which way the world is going to go with all of this upheaval happening now, whether people will think that there is simply absolutely no anchor to anything, or whether at some point they'll decide that maybe this is getting a little bit too crazy and we need to find some sort of universal basis that we can all cling to, I guess, in terms of do we want to live in a society or do we want to just truly each be individuals scrapping away for whatever we can get? I guess, maybe, as you said, the approach of a person like Badiou is to identify the truths and to help people to see the truths. In a way, I guess that type of philosopher is one who maybe if the people who can't see the truths are like the prisoner in the cave and they're watching these images on their two-dimensional screens, the philosopher's role is to maybe kind of introduce something different, allow them to look at something different, allow them to understand that they're being manipulated maybe by other people unaware, like the men on the parapet who are shining those images on the wall. And yeah, maybe it's maybe just revealing to people that there are these forces at work that are driving them. Maybe when you think that you're acting freely, maybe you're not.
James, I love the way you frame that just because it highlights so much about your character and as a person and how much you care about your neighbors and fellow citizens, and you're frustrated by seeing people you care about manipulated. But I think part of Badiou's insight and why he's such an interesting and insightful reader of Plato is that he actually thinks that's not a good starting point. As much as the intention is right, he would totally agree that your heart is in the right place. The problem is you can't see until your eyes have been opened. And that is the sort of genius he thinks of Plato's notion of the event is what an event really is it's a shock wave that shakes the scales from your eyes and allows you to see something that you couldn't see before. And the reason you couldn't see it is because you were so mired in the system, in the way of looking at the world, that you couldn't see anything that contradicted that way of looking at the world. It's kind of like the old adage that a fish can't sense water, right? That, water is so pervasive to the world that it just is their world. And so if you had been a fish all your life and then another fish said, imagine a world outside of water, it's not, that's just not going to work. Instead, if a fish gets, say, catapulted from the ocean by a wave and is flying through the air for a moment, now an event has happened and they can imagine a world without water. And that's kind of how Badiou is reading The Cave, is that it's just not enough to try and persuade people because they need a different set of eyes first. Now, I want to be clear. Badiou does not think you can manufacture an event. And this was my comment earlier about he thinks of them kind of like miracles. An events happen because of contradictions in the system. You can't force them to happen. That means you can't go around just trying to manufacture events for your neighbors so that they'll see the light. Rather, Badiou says our job is to discern the events that have already happened in human history and to become people who are ready for the next event so that as soon as it happens, we can hit the ground running, taking advantage of the opportunity to then persuade our fellow neighbors and citizens who might be able to now see.
That's a great explanation. Yeah, and I love that shockwave analogy. Maybe there's shockwaves going on now and people just are not seeing, right? We just become so used to these things happening that we're just not seeing those shockwaves. But no, that's great. And so I thought this was a great place to start. Maybe we can go on to our next reading. And maybe do you want to start this one?
Okay. The remaining readings we're going to discuss today come from a lecture that Badiou gave, which was published in a little book. The book is called Philosophy for the Present. So it's very much this, how do we speak Plato for today? And the lecture was entitled Thinking the Event. So we're reading selections from the first half of that lecture. So this is Badiou speaking. So I would like us to ask the following question. What is a situation that is really a situation for philosophy, a situation for philosophical thought? I'm going to offer you a few examples of philosophical situations in order to give you some grasp of what I'm referring to. The first example is already, if I can put it like this, philosophically formatted. It can be found in Plato's dialogue Gorgias. This dialogue presents the extremely brutal encounter between Socrates and Callicles. This encounter creates a philosophical situation, which, moreover, is set out in an entirely theatrical fashion. Why? Because the thought of Socrates and that of Callicles share no common measure. They are totally foreign to one another. The discussion between Callicles and Socrates is written by Plato so as to make us understand what it means for there to be two different kinds of thought, which, like the diagonal and the side of a square, remain incommensurable. This discussion amounts to a relation between two terms devoid of any relation. Callicles argues that might is right, that the happy man is a tyrant, the one who prevails over others through cunning and violence. Socrates, on the contrary, maintains that the true man, who is the same as the happy man, is the just in the philosophical sense of the term. Between justice as violence and justice as thought, there is no simple opposition of the kind that could be dealt with by means of arguments covered by a common norm. There is a lack of any real relation. Therefore, the discussion is not a discussion, it is a confrontation. And what will be clear to any reader of the text is not that one interlocutor will convince the other, but that there will be a victor and a vanquished. This is, after all, what explains why Socrates' methods in third dialogue are hardly fairer than those of Callicles. Wanting the ends means wanting the means, and it is a matter of winning, especially of winning in the eyes of the young men who witness the scene. In the end, Callicles is defeated. He doesn't acknowledge defeat, but he shuts up and remains in his corner. Note that he is vanquished in a dialogue staged by Plato. This is probably one of the rare occurrences when someone like Callicles is vanquished. Such are the joys of the theater. Faced with a situation, what is philosophy? The sole task of philosophy is to show that we must choose. We must choose between these two types of thought. We must decide whether we want to be on the side of Socrates or on the side of Callicles. In this example, philosophy confronts thinking as choice, thinking as decision. Its proper task is to elucidate choice so that we can say the following: a philosophical situation consists in the moment when a choice is elucidated, a choice of existence or a choice of thought. There ends the reading. And James, I'd actually like to ask you a question to kick off our discussion of this passage
Mhm.
because there's a mathematical metaphor in here that I'm quite sure that you loved. But before I ask you the question, I just want to highlight for listeners that part of the reason why Badiou is so interested in this staging is because his confrontation, let's say, between himself and Nietzsche would be identical to the confrontation here between Socrates and Callicles. So this is an updating of the same debate we just saw in the last reading. So James, I'm curious to know, what did you make of this analogy about the incommensurability of the diagonal on the side of a square as representing two forms of thought that have no common ground? And if you could elaborate the metaphor for us.
Yeah, I love that. Immediately as I read that, I immediately thought of the Meno and the scene where Socrates shows the slave diagrams of a square and the diagonal of a square. And, I guess this really relates in this passage. I love when he talks about that there's no common measure. And it's a really good analogy of there being no common measure. Well, you have a square, and say like the square, each of the sides is length one, and then the diagonal will be the square root of two. So one is a rational number. It can be set out as a fixed fraction. 1/1 equals 1. 2/2 equals 1. So that's rational. The sides of the square are rational. What's not rational is the diagonal. The square root of 2 is not a rational number. And that's proven not empirically, but by reductio ad absurdum. And so the square root of 2, the diagonal, can be expressed as a continuing fraction. It never ends. So whereas the sides of the square are fixed fractions, the diagonal is an ongoing, never-ending fraction. But the interesting thing about this is when he's talking about lack of a common ground, the diagonal does touch the sides of the square. It touches two of the vertices, right? And there's two diagonals, so you get diagonals across all four vertices. So there is that connection, like there is the connection between Socrates and Callicles. Like they're both in the same discussion. They're both in the same square, I guess. It's just that they don't have that common measure. They don't have that common sense of thinking. And that really, that really struck me. I love his use of that. And I can only imagine that he was thinking of the Meno when he came up with that analogy of the square.
Yeah, wonderful. And I think that he's really trying to highlight for us that to kind of build on our last discussion, because there's no common measure, this is not a dialogue between Callicles and Socrates. And this is an interesting point. I mean, he's making a stylistic or an artistic distinction between a certain subset of Plato's dialogues and others. For me, the Protagoras would be another one that falls into this camp where we're not really having a dialogue, we're having a jousting match. Another example of this would be the difference between the conversation between Glaucon, Adamantius, and Socrates in the majority of the Republic versus the discussion between Thrasymachus and Socrates. Because there's no hope of persuasion, because there's not really a common language of thought, of values, right? One person is operating according to a set of norms that says the only real thing is the shadows on the wall, and the other is operating to a set of norms that says the most real thing are the forms that define being. And there's no, they don't agree on reality. And therefore one cannot persuade the other. And so we get this amazing comment where he says that this is about winning the hearts and minds of the youth who are witnessing this jousting match. That Socrates is not doing this to, at this point, save Callicles' soul. That's for the gods to deal with. He's doing this to save the souls of those who might be infected with Callicles' way of thinking.
Yeah, and that's a really good way of putting it because a continuing concern of mine is the way youth are being educated now, or the examples that they are seeing are a lot of the times examples where there is a clear lack of virtue, where the assumption is that there is a victor and a vanquished, because this is what authoritarian leaders, this is their method of play. They want to be the victor and they want to vanquish their enemies. And so winner takes it all, kind of like Thrasymachus in the Republic. And so when I see children following this example, it's worrisome because they're not exposed to the more universal things, the more permanent things, and it doesn't really call to them to think for themselves. They're following somebody else's line of thought, maybe. That's a concern of mine, especially with technology. As technology is so pervasive, we tend to believe what we see on our screens, and what's put there is put there by people who are often now anonymous. At least Callicles was there and Protagoras was there, and you knew who they were. They were sophists with names. But now I think we are surrounded by nameless sophists, maybe, and some who aren't as good. So yeah, I think that's a key thing.
That's a great way to make my earlier point about Nietzsche. Um, Again, even though I am an avowed follower of Plato, I find Nietzsche to be an exhilarating read, and he sharpens my thought. He's iron sharpens iron. Nietzsche is an incredible sparring partner to think more carefully and more deeply. And it's very clear that Plato had deep respect for Protagoras and deep respect for Gorgias, who is the actual name bearer of that dialogue. And I've always thought it's so interesting that Gorgias doesn't really hang around in the contest very long. It falls to two other interlocutors, the last of whom, Callicles, is a fictional creation. Unlike most of the dialogues where the characters are based on real people that Plato knew or knew of, Callicles is a complete fictional invention. Why? I think it's to make that contrast you just did, which is that Gorgias was a real person, famous, thoughtful, profound thinker, not the same as the foolish, general of some army who's just using their sophistry to justify a bombing campaign. Or, like you said, some tech tycoon causing trouble on social media. Or even just ordinary people who have spent too much time on YouTube and who have lost their way. In all of those cases, we're dealing with far inferior versions of an already bad way of looking at the world. And those are even more pernicious now that we live in an age of mass media and a kind of flattening of society where, quote unquote, everyone has a right to an opinion.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and I think where he ends there, so that we can say the following: a philosophical situation consists in the moment when a choice is elucidated, a choice of existence or a choice of thought. I wonder how many realize now that they do have a choice. Yeah, and maybe that's again where that shockwave is out there, but it just people need to see the light of it, I guess, maybe.
Well, note that he is giving a task to those of us who want to be true philosophers. He's saying, yes, people have a choice, but it's the task of philosophy to show that we have a choice. So again, what should we be doing as students of Plato? We should be making that choice apparent. We should be putting the choice in front of people and making clear to them, whether through the theater or through argument or through, cleverly written tweets, I don't know, but in each venue, making clear to them what the choice is.
And that's a good way to introduce the second reading, which is just one sentence. The second part, he says, first definition of the philosophical situation, clarify the choice, the decision. Second definition of the philosophical situation, clarify the distance between power and truths. And this goes to what your introduction in terms of that distance between truth and power. Power could be truth, I guess, but is not necessarily. And we tend to think maybe that the powerful voices have some, just because they're so prevalent now, that there is some sort of basis in truth and that they should be listened to. So I really like that sentence about find the distance between the power and the philosophy.
Yeah. Um, Power can either obscure a truth or power can be subservient to a truth. Plato's way of putting that would be power can obscure the good or power can be subservient to the good. And Badiou has written really eloquently about this in other works where he talks about how the role of authoritarian regimes is to often revise the past. And why do they want to do that? There are obviously multiple reasons, but one that Badiou gives that's really interesting is he says because the past always has events in it, and authoritarians need to obscure the eventual past so that the truths that emerge from those events are obscured from the people. So they need a past that sort of implies that the regime is just embodying the way things always were. So if you think about the Third Reich and their narrative around the Aryan race, they wanted to create a history and a narrative that these are the true Germans and they've always been there. And there were never any breaks. There were just, you know, unfortunate lapses and we've got to recover the essence of the Aryan spirit and so on. And this is all fabrications. And the real purpose of the fabrication is to obscure the kinds of breaks in history, the events that instead suggested that there is an equality between humans regardless of race or class or sex, which the Nazis were very keen to bring those hierarchies back into play.
And that's a great example because as a student of history, quite rightly, you said there was never an Aryan race, an Aryan nation, but they invent this myth and not so noble lie to go to go back again to the Republic, a not so noble lie. And but I think we see this happening across the world now, and in a number of nations where the past, as you said so clearly, is being obscured. And I think people's memories are becoming shorter. I've said this with technology, we things just happen so quickly now and they're transmitted and broadcast so quickly that it's impossible to keep up with the sequence of cause and effect. And that obscures the events. As you said, these events of the past are easily forgotten. And we just almost think when in the morning we wake up, it's like a blank slate and we just have to follow whatever the news is telling us we have to follow that day. So I think it's really, yeah, I really like the way that you said that, obscuring the past. That's kind of like George Orwell's 1984. Dear leader, every morning they pour the previous day's newspapers down the memory hole and you start you start the day afresh. So yeah, really interesting.
And just to make sure that people understand the significance of why you have that quote there, what he develops in the longer lecture is the distance between power and truth is supposed to be that truths are not subjective. And what that means practically is truths will never, never be aligned with what the dear leader wants. And that's a really deep and important Platonic point. And this is why I go back to Plato, because as far as I know, Plato was one of the first humans in history to really say that and articulate it, that truths are truly transcendental and they are for all. They're not for the dear leader. They're not for the oligarchs. They're not for the plutocrats. They are for all and they transcend all. And so, if you have a group of people who are in power and they are claiming to speak on behalf of a truth, they are lying. And Badiou here is saying that a part of a philosopher's responsibility is to say that.
Mm. Yeah, I really like the way you said that the truths are for all and transcend all, to the extent that we're told, maybe by a Nietzschean type of philosopher, that we can find our way to our own truth. Maybe that's a bit of a false sense of security, in that our truths will then clash with other people's truths. And we wind up in this eternal battle where everybody's battling for their concept of the truth, when maybe they should just stand back and see that we're all part of a greater truth and find some sort of harmony and virtue in that. And I think, yeah, this is very symptomatic of what's going on in the world today. Very symptomatic. Well, why don't we go on to the next reading? Maybe I'll do this one. So he mentioned he had three examples in that last reading that you did. And just for the sake of time, we didn't do the second example, which was the death of Archimedes. And then the third example was one that involved a film called Crucified Lovers by Japanese director Mizoguchi. Really interesting. He gives a little description of this film about these two lovers who fall desperately in love. The woman is married. She's not allowed to do this. So they escape and they think they can get freedom, but they're caught and then they're forced to go to a terrible death. But their love transcends all. So I guess that's that love theme that you mentioned, this truth, this revelation to them, this love, these two lovers in this movie that he quotes. So in this part, he says, at a conference held at the Famille, Deleuze, quoting Moreau, once said that art is what resists death. Well, in these magnificent shots, Mizugushi's art not only resists death, but leads us to think that love too resists death. This creates a complicity between love and art, one which, in a sense, we've always known about. What I here name the smile of the lovers, for lack of a better word, is a philosophical situation. And this is, he refers to these lovers going to their death and they're smiling. And he says, why? Because in it we once again encounter something incommensurable, a relation without relation. Between the event of love, the turning upside down of existence, and the ordinary rules of live, the laws of the city, the laws of marriage, there is no common measure. What will philosophy tell us then? It will tell us that, quote, we must think the event, unquote. We must think the exception. We must know what we have to say about what is not ordinary. We must think the transformation of life. We can now sum up the tasks of philosophy with regard to situations. First, to throw light on the fundamental choices of thought. In the last instance, as Althusser would say, such choices are always between what is interested and what is disinterested. Second, to throw light on the distance between thinking and power, between truths and the state, to measure the distance, to know whether or not it can be crossed. Third, to throw light on the value of exception, the value of the event, the value of the break, and to do this against the continuity of life, against social conservatism. These are the three great tasks of philosophy: to deal with choice, with distance, and with the exception. At least the philosophy is to count for something in life, to be something other than an academic discipline. And that's the end of that little section. So I really thought that that was interesting how he clearly defines the event as the difference. We have to recognize these differences and think about them. What caused them? What caused these variances? Otherwise, we kind of get stuck on this path that we're just not thinking. We're just following the path blindly. But when we think about the differences, think about the events, maybe we see different paths.
Yeah, he calls the event the vision of the exception or the value of the break. One of the examples that he uses in later work is this idea that in a political situation, there's always a community who gets ignored and who has no voice. And he calls that community the exception of the event. And what he means by that is they're a group of people who, well, let's take a concrete example. So, the situation in the Jim Crow South in the United States in the first part of the 20th century. So, it's not like Black folks' lives were any worse in the 1960s when the Voting Rights Act was passed and the final bit of civil rights legislation was passed. Their lives have been, horrible for 100 years, and then before the Civil War, even worse. So why is it that it took 100 years for the United States to finally enforce, well, yeah, almost exactly 100 years, actually. I don't think I've realized that until now, to actually create legislation that would enforce the Reconstruction amendments that were passed in the wake of the Civil War. So Black folk were supposed to be free and full citizens immediately after the Civil War, but they weren't for another 100 years. Why? Badu wants to say it's because there's a sense in which, for the ordinary way of doing American things, business, going to church, raising your children, whatnot, those people and their place in society were invisible. You can even see this if you watch old black and white movies from the 40s and 50s. You'll notice that if you ever see a black person in America, it's only as like a porter or a bellhop or something. And what Badu is sort of trying to suggest is that the late 1950s, and especially in the early 1960s, formed an event in the consciousness of the United States in which the exception suddenly rose to consciousness and became visible. And the exception suggests a truth, namely a world, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, where people are judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. That's the truth that emerges from the event. And fortunately, by that time, the United States was ready to be faithful to that truth, which is another way of saying what he says here of thinking the event, and to do this against the continuity of life. That is, to not keep doing things the way they've been done, to make a real change. That fidelity happened then because the leaders who were in power at that time were ready to be faithful to the event. Whereas if you want to call the Civil War an event in American history, I think there's a lot of reason to say that the nation was not ready to be faithful to the event that Lincoln was trying to inaugurate. He was assassinated before he could fully lead the nation to be faithful to that truth. We capitulated, and that's why Black folks suffered for another 100 years.
Yeah, it's interesting actually that the way that people conform to a way of being, and I watch a lot of those old, I love those black and white movies. There's a lot of good plot and ideas in them that don't necessarily come out in modern movies, but There's an interesting thing in the US. So we often hear this term US politicians use, the American people. Hearing that as a Canadian, I think of it as, well, is there this amorphous mass of American people and do they all think with one mind? It's very interesting because in Canada, we don't have that. We never hear the term the Canadian people. And maybe it's just that we're a small country and we don't really matter, but um, well, we do matter. We do matter. And it's interesting too that, there was that great event in the 60s, that sort of civil rights movement. And so there was a lot of thinking the event, I guess. But that thought process may have died down or been obscured, or maybe it gets taken for granted and people stop thinking about it. When they stop thinking about it, things slide back. Does he ever talk about thinking the event and then forgetting the event?
Oh, all the time.
Yeah.
All the time, yes. And this is why this is, I think, the principal reason he has replaced the language of virtue with the language of fidelity or faithfulness. Again, not that there's anything wrong with virtue, it's just he's got his specific concerns. He gets the language of fidelity from Christianity. So again, he's an atheist, but he's an atheist who wrote a whole book on St. Paul and who regularly references the writings of Christian philosophers like Kierkegaard. And the reason he's interested in that stuff is because when you convert to a religion, right, there's this sort of honeymoon period in which you're like enamored. And then the going gets hard, and you kind of forget about why you converted to the religion in the first place. Or you find out that your extended family members are not on board with your new religious identity and they're shunning you. Or you find out that you live in a social context where your religious identity is persecuted. And now it's like, is this really worth it? And so Badiou is really aware that to be a religious person is to learn the practice of faith. That is, how to hold on to the inspiration and the convictions that oriented your conversion in the first place when you're long after that event. And so he's drawing that analogy and bringing that into the philosophical practice to say, there can't just be this objective diagnosis of the truth that emerges from the event. There also has to be this subjective faithfulness in which I learn how to discipline myself to be faithful to the event, even when the going gets hard. And he thinks that when there's not that kind of discipline, there's not that kind of almost religious like practice of constantly renewing one's fidelities, then we become forgetful, or more significantly, those of us who live in a world of global capitalism, we become distracted. And he really thinks that is the purpose of capitalism. It's to distract us from the event. It's to make it so that we're too busy scrolling, doom scrolling on social media, or trying to buy the latest smartphone, to stop and think, wait, what do I really believe? What do I really stand for? Was there something beyond me that laid a claim on me to live my life differently?
Hmm. Yeah, and I think throughout life we make so many compromises to accommodate differences of opinion and to, get through life efficiently, that sometimes, yeah, we forget what our original thinking was and what our beliefs were. Maybe this is a good time to do the fourth reading because this talks about politics, and I wanted to say a few things about his view of politics, which may be a little bit more tied to his time maybe than it is ours, but do you want to do this reading?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So we can say that philosophy, which is the thought, not of what there is, but of what is not what there is, that is, not of contracts, but of contracts broken. Philosophy is exclusively interested in relations that are not relations. Plato once said that philosophy is an awakening, and he knew perfectly well that awakening implies a difficult break with sleep. For Plato already and for all time, Philosophy is the seizure of thought, of what breaks with the sleep of thought. So it is legitimate to think that each time there is a paradoxical relation, that is, a relation which is not a relation, a situation of rupture, then philosophy can take place. I insist on this point. It is not because there is something that there is philosophy. Philosophy is not at all a reflection on anything whatsoever. There is philosophy and there can be philosophy because there are paradoxical relations, because there are breaks, decisions, distances, events. We can throw some further light on this with examples which are neither legends, like the death of Archimedes, nor literary constructions, like the figure of Callicles, nor filmic poems, like the tale of the Japanese lovers. Let's take some good, simple, contemporary examples, a negative one and a positive one. My negative example is very simple. It concerns the reason why philosophers in general do not have anything interesting to say about electoral choices. Consider the usual situation of standard parliamentarianism. And let me just pause from the reading real quick to say parliamentarianism is Badiou's preferred term for electoral liberal democracies. So that's his jargon, if you will. So that's what he means, electoral liberal democracies. Continuing the reading. When you are confronted with electoral choices under standard parliamentarianism, you don't really possess any of the criteria that justify and legitimate the intervention of philosophy. I'm not saying that one shouldn't be interested in these situations. I am simply saying that one cannot be interested in them in a philosophical manner. When the philosopher offers his views about these matters, he is an ordinary citizen, nothing more. He does not speak from a position of genuine philosophical consistency. So, why are things like this? Basically, because in standard parliamentarianism, in its usual functioning, the majority and the opposition are commensurable. There is obviously a common measure between the majority and the opposition, which means you do not have the paradoxical relation. You have differences naturally, but these differences do not amount to a paradoxical relationship. On the contrary, they constitute a regular, law governed relationship. This is easily grasped. Sooner or later, this is what is referred to as a democratic alternation, the opposition will replace the majority or take its place. It is indeed necessary for there to be a common measure between the two. If you don't have a common measure, you will not be able to substitute the one with the other. So the terms are commensurable, and to the extent that they are commensurable, you do not have the situation of radical exception. What's more, you do not have a truly radical choice. The decision is a decision between nuances, between small differences, as you know. Elections are generally decided by the small group of the hesitant, those who do not possess a stable, preformed opinion. People who have a genuine commitment constitute fixed blocks. And then there is a small group of people in what is called the center, who sometimes go one way, sometimes the other. And you can see why a decision taken by people whose principal characteristic is hesitation is a very particular decision. It is not a decision taken by decisive people. It is a decision of the undecided, or of those who have not decided and who will then decide for reasons of opportunity or last minute reasons. So the function of choice in its true breadth is absent. There is proximity rather than distance. The election does not create a gap. It is the rule. It creates the realization of the rule. Finally, you do not have the hypothesis of a veritable event. You do not have the feeling of exception, because you are instead in the presence of the feeling of the institution, of the regular functioning of institutions. But there is obviously a fundamental tension between institution and exception. So the question of elections for the philosopher is a typical matter of opinion, which is to say, it doesn't have to do with the incommensurable, with radical choice, distance, or exception. As a phenomenon of opinion, it does not constitute a sign for the creation of new problems. There ends the reading. And I just want to say one quick thing, which is this is supposed to be Badiou's version of Plato's critique of democracy from Book 8 of the Republic. So just in case readers were trying to read between the lines, that's what he's doing here. Go ahead, James.
Yeah. There's some great lines in here. I really like the philosophy is the seizure by thought of what breaks with the sleep of thought. I mean, I guess I understand where he's coming from. Traditionally, in liberal democracies, we tend to alternate between governments on one side of the center or the other. But I think more lately, and largely, I think under the influence of unbased opinions, unfounded opinions that are broadcast at the speed of light using social media technology, that it's no longer that way. And the real, maybe the human nature that's prone to reaction, but not to that taking the time and effort to think, that's maybe taken over. And this is where I think that maybe some of his views of politics may be maybe a little bit more standard of his time rather than what it has now become. And I mean, when he says the majority and the opposition are commensurable, I think we certainly see cases now where that simply isn't the case. And so instead of the sides of the square being commensurable, you have the square and the diagonal, which will never meet. They touch, but they inflame each other whenever they touch. So I guess too, there's a few philosophical politicians in the past. We had one in my country, and really, as a child, I was as a not as a child, but as a teenager, I was really taken by the larger view of Pierre Trudeau, our recent prime minister's father. Um, just from the sense that he talked about things like the just society, which was not a thing that was just of the day, it was a larger idea. And another politician who really, really, I mean, I don't know how many times I've listened to Bobby Kennedy's Ripple of Hope speech, 1966, I think, delivered in South Africa. But there was a politician who actually used philosophers' names in the speech and again called to people's better ideals. He was trying to find that common ground. So I'm wondering if philosophy and politics could be really the art of finding the common ground as opposed to just this sort of functional backwards and forwards. You get tired of the government after 10 years, you throw them out. You get tired of the next guys after 10 years, you throw them out. It seems like he has a little bit of that kind of view of it, but I think that maybe and at this particular juncture of time where politics are so fraught and so many authoritarians are trying to take control, that I think, is this the time for philosophy?
Absolutely. Yeah, let's get some facts on the ground first. So this essay, I don't know exactly when he gave the lecture, but the French and German version of the essay, because I think this was presented in French, was published in 2005, just so we have some dating here. And then the English translation came out in 2009. So this is 20 years ago that he's writing this. And the second fact is he's predominantly thinking about political trends on the European continent and in England. So that's his frame of reference. And he has written extensively on the history of French politics and French democracy, and he's a pretty trenchant critic of a lot of what has happened there. Um, I think he would very much agree with you that he is describing the ordinary case of the parliamentary style of politics, and that you're right that it does seem like we're in a different situation today. But I want to highlight what I think is the real genius of this passage, which is his point here, I think, is that when you vote a government out of office and you put the opposition in power, why are you doing that? Are you doing it because I have an opinion that the old government has sort of overstayed their welcome and it's time for a change? Or are you doing it because you're being faithful to a truth? That's really the heart of what he's getting at here. And he's not talking about you and me as individuals. He's talking about the electorate, the masses of voters. And he's saying it really seems like the determining factor in the outcome of an election is the contest of opinions by the talking heads, by the editorial writers, and so forth, not because people are seized by an idea and being faithful to it. Now, he's not saying that has to be the case. So you identified a Canadian politician that you admire who you felt did articulate an idea that he called people to be faithful to. Okay, so that is absolutely possible. But now we come to the rub. You said that person's name was Pierre Trudeau. Let's say that Pierre Trudeau's idea is a truth. Badou's going to say any truth that's really a truth is always a truth, meaning you should never stop having a government that works under the oversight of that truth, never stops having that truth as a goal, which means whether or not you maintain those particular people in office or somebody else, you would never want to vote in an opposition who is against the truth. That's what he thinks is the problem, is that this whole electoral dynamic is whatever the party in power is for, if I'm not a part of that party, then I'm against that. And he wants to say, what does that have to do with the truth? If the party in power is for the truth and they're just bad at managing it, let's say that they're bad leaders, what your campaign should be is I am for that truth. I just think I can be faithful to it better than they can. But instead, what we get is these dual sides where whatever one side is for, the other side is against. And Badu wants to say that sounds like sophistry. That doesn't sound like people who are interested in a transcendental truth. So that would be my take of what he's trying to do there. And I'm curious whether or not any of that intersects with how you were thinking.
Hmm. Very much so. I think that, yeah, we don't see, well, first of all, we are not given anymore. I mean, I can't think of politics in the last 30, 40 years, maybe, where big ideas have been talked about. It's been all, just the economics of the day, particular geopolitical events. But the larger part of reforming society, making things better for everybody is just kind of left by the wayside. And I mentioned in a previous episode that we had an election in my province here. We're now facing an election nationally in Canada. Do we hear of any of the politicians talking about the truth? No, they're talking about tax cuts, which it can't be like you're going to have to borrow money to give a tax cut. Okay, so let's talk about the truth behind that, but nobody wants to talk about the truth behind that. So I think that's really sorely missing. And what's really missing, I think, even with politicians who do operate with some sort of, you know, truth anchor under them, and there are some examples that I can think of, I won't name names, but I think they just get mired in this bad communication. And that's what I'm wondering whether a philosophical approach might help the communication. In other words, you have to remind people why you're doing things, why you've taken a particular path, particular options. You have to remind them that it's part of a greater attempt to make things better, improve the common good. And I think that kind of messaging has been lost now with this instantaneous, you have to get out a quick, snappy phrase on YouTube, and people don't want to spend time to listen to a lengthy argument. They just want a catchy phrase. And so I think that's a real problem now. Whereas Bobby Kennedy in 1966, it was a very different world. There was no internet, there was no YouTube, no TikTok, and so he could give this beautiful speech and it had time to percolate through people's memories and it still lives on now. But I think everything is now so geared for a very, very short attention span that I think any politician who even thought of trying to approach things a little bit philosophically, his whole party or her whole party would just rein them in and say, no, you can't do that. You're going to get crucified. I don't know. I mean, what's your thinking?
I think that's an excellent diagnosis of the situation. And that is why Badiou here is talking about genuine philosophical situations, a situation where a break is needed, meaning where we recognize that the status quo no longer works. That even well-meaning good people who enter into politics get bogged down in the machinery of the bureaucracy, of the negotiations and the constant compromises and the backsliding and so on. And so they're never able to really enact a truly just policy for the common good that lasts. Again, there's no claim here, and Badiou is certainly not claiming that people don't pass good legislation from time to time, of course. But how do you know that 5 years from now the opposition is not going to come in and repeal everything? That's the problem, is you can't remain faithful to just goals for an extended period of time. And the other thing that that I think really intersects with this problem that you've raised is his discussion of hesitation being the deciding factor in elections, that elections are not decided by people deeply convinced of what is true. They're decided by the swing voters, the people on the margins who haven't made up their mind. And social scientists have done experiments for decades that have shown oftentimes those people make their decisions for purely capricious reasons. How an undecided voter ends up voting sometimes can be determined by what their blood sugar level is when they actually go to cast a vote.
Yeah.
And so again, Badiou wants to say there's nothing about truth going on here. These are arbitrary decisions being made for bad reasons. And what we need is a real choice between what kind of people we're going to be and what kind of people we don't want to be. And if we don't ever permit ourselves to make that kind of truly radical choice, we're not going to have a break from the past. And again, this past doesn't have to be something that's like catastrophically evil. It can just be something that's a mire or a bog that prevents us from actually doing something truly, radically, genuinely good.
And we do get bogged down, I think, a lot. That's the bog example is a good one. And, it's not even just the undecided voters now, it's the people who don't even go to vote. And I think it's becoming common in Western democracies that, maybe 40%, 50% of the voters don't even show up. And so they're allowing the others who do show up to decide, some of who are undecided and, as you say, cast their votes for reasons that aren't necessarily rational. This is a big problem. And then this short-term thinking, because yeah, it's just going from one election to the next. And it's the lack of the long-term thinking in our political system, I think, especially now, is becoming very damaging.
Now, I just want to emphasize the correctness of your earlier question. You said, isn't now a time for philosophy? Because you have the sense that the party in power and the opposition are no longer commensurable in many Western democracies. And we have to remember, Badiou here is making a modern version of Plato's criticism of democracy in the Republic. But remember, Plato is very clear that democracy is not the worst thing. There is always a worse thing, and that worst thing is totalitarianism, is tyranny. And so which democracies are always vulnerable to sliding into. And there
Mhm.
is an incommensurability in Plato between democracy and tyranny. So Badiou is only making comments here about the functioning of democracy within the democratic regime. He absolutely agrees that between democracy and tyranny, there is an absolute choice.
Yeah, clearly, and that it's good to point out. Well, in the interest of time, maybe I'll go ahead and do our last reading here, and then we can sort of wrap up with some thoughts about Plato in the 21st century through people like Badiou and others. So this is closer to the end of his of this section. He says, "I insist on the singularity of philosophical commitment. We must absolutely distinguish philosophy from politics. There are political commitments that are eliminated by philosophy or even made necessary by philosophy, but philosophy and politics are distinct. Politics aims at the transformation of collective situations, while philosophy seeks to propose new problems for everyone. And this proposition concerning new philosophical problems constitutes an entirely different form of judgment than the one which pertains to direct political militancy. Of course, philosophy can work on the basis of political science. It can constitute problems using political science. But that does not mean that it can be confused with politics itself. This means that we can very easily imagine that, at a given moment, certain circumstances may be very important for politics, but not for philosophy, or vice versa. That is why philosophical commitment can sometimes seem very mysterious, even incomprehensible. Genuine philosophical commitment, the kind which is immersed in the incommensurable and summons the choice of thought, staging exceptions, creating distances, and especially distancing from forms of power, is often a strange commitment. There is a very interesting text by Plato on this point, a text that you can find at the end of Book 9 of the Republic. As you know, in the Republic, Plato outlined a kind of philosophical utopia, so that one could precisely think that in this book, philosophy and politics are very close. At the end of Book 9, Socrates is discoursing with some youths, as always, and some among them say to him, "This whole story is very nice, but it will never be realized anywhere." The critique of utopia was already in place. So they say to him, "Your republic will never exist anywhere." And Socrates replies, "In any case, perhaps it will exist somewhere else than our country." In other words, he says that it will take place abroad, that there will be something foreign and strange about it. I think it is very important to understand this. Genuine philosophical commitment in situations creates a foreignness. In a general sense, it is foreign. And when it is simply commonplace, when it does not possess this foreignness, when it is not immersed in this paradox, then it is a political commitment, an ideological commitment, the commitment of a citizen, but it is not necessarily a philosophical commitment. Philosophical commitment is marked by its internal foreignness. This makes me think of a poem that I love very much, a poem by the French poet Saint Jean Perse, a great epic poem called Anabasis. In this poem, at the end of section 5, you find the following lines, which I'd read to you. The stranger, closed in his new thoughts, acquires still more partisans in the ways of silence. This is the definition of philosophical commitment. The philosopher is always a stranger, clothed in his new thoughts. This means that he proposes new thoughts and new problems, and he acquires still more partisans in the way of silence. This means that he is capable of rallying a great number of people to these new problems because he has convinced them that these problems are universal. What matters is that those whom the philosopher addresses are convinced first of all through the silence of conviction and not through the rhetoric of discourse. But as you can see, this figure of the stranger, who with his new thoughts makes companions for himself, often silent companions, rests entirely on the conviction that there are universal propositions, propositions addressed to the whole of humanity without exception. So that brings in the Republic where we started with. This idea of foreignness I thought was very interesting. And again, I guess this idea of an event being this difference, this foreignness, something that we're not used to. Get out of the box, I guess, and think differently. It's an interesting view on politics and philosophy. I'm still not reconciled to his thoughts on politics necessarily, but maybe that's because my thinking is colored by this particular time. Although I've been active in politics at various points in my life for 40 years more. So it's not that I'm a stranger to it, but it's just politics is maybe becoming strange.
Well, it's possible that it is easier to have an amiable relationship to politics in Canada.
Mhm.
Because you all tend to be more good-natured and tempestuous than the rest of us. Yeah, again, I want to emphasize Badiou is doing most of his thinking in France, and I don't want to get into the details here, but France has a really checkered political history and has been involved in some truly atrocious um, human rights violations, both in its imperial history, but since then as well. And so I think a lot of this depends on the country that you live in. And I think, Badiou is an advocate for real political transformation, and he doesn't shy away from that. And whether or not that's something that strongly attracts you, I think really depends on how badly you need
Mhm.
it. But I wanted to say a couple things about the text. So the first thing is I wanted to just comment on his use of the word utopia here, because he's using it just slightly different than the way I use the word utopia. So I tend to use the word utopia, and I've used this in past episodes on Plato's Pod to denote a vision of society where we've solved all the problems. There's nothing left to worry about. He is not saying that Plato is proposing a political utopia in that sense. Okay. What he means by a utopia here is something more like a Plato is having Socrates imagine a society where justice is actually practiced, not where we're envisioning, oh, wouldn't it be nice? But that's nothing like what we have today. No, this is a society where they have done the thing. And so that's what he means by saying philosophy says, well, maybe it has happened in a far off country. In other words, it's foreign to our actual practice of society, which so often is far from justice. And that's really what he means by a utopia here is we're envisioning what would it be like to actually have a just society. And then so the second thing I wanted to say is about this notion of foreignness. Again, Badiou really does think that fidelity to a truth that emerges from an event is about seeing a possibility that is a radical break from the way things have been. And it's not just an arbitrary break, it's a break from the injustice of how things have been politically to a truth that moves us closer to justice. And we could apply this in those other contexts. So, in the scientific context, let's say the Newtonian break from the Aristotelian physics that preceded it is about imagining a really different way to organize our theories about how the world is related. And most significantly, for what Galileo and Newton were doing, was the reconciliation of the celestial realm to the sublunar terrestrial realm, right? That was an enormous scientific transformation. So that's keep those in mind as the model of what he's getting at here about the foreignness. Um, when Galileo and his collaborators are trying to describe this unified view of the cosmos, it was foreign. And so that's really what he's getting at with the foreignness is if your beliefs stop being foreign, that generally means that's because you've become comfortable with the prevailing scientific model, or you've become comfortable with the prevailing forms of art, and now you're just happy to let capitalism churn off infinite copies for sale. Or you've become comfortable with the prevailing political rulers and attitudes. And Badiou wants to say real truth in the Platonic sense is about looking for the exceptions, about the things that we've overlooked, the oppressions that we're not seeing, the artistic possibilities that we haven't opened ourselves to, the scientific discoveries that have yet to come. And that is where the philosopher should be.
Mhm. Well said. And yeah, the Galileo example is a really good one because he was forced to conform with the Orthodox view at the time. He published a book and then he faced the Inquisition and he was told that he really had to stop talking about this. So he did stop talking about it. And I think it was about 10 years before things thawed a little bit and he could start talking about it again. But of course, people like Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake for saying that the earth revolves around the sun. So, that's the orthodox position that people can lead if they don't take a philosophical view of it. And I like his words in this one section that I read: genuine philosophical commitment, the kind which is immersed in incommensurable and summons the choice of thought, staging exceptions, creating distances, and especially distancing from forms of power, is often a strange commitment. And I think, yeah, when orthodox views prevail, especially when they're enforced by powerful people, that's the problem. And that's where, I guess, when one of the first readings that we did, where he said, philosophy is about choice and understanding the choice. I think that's really key, maybe key to today's world.
So let me, as some comments to kind of help us wrap up, kind of say, why I think Badiou is interesting as a Platonist. It's because when I now look at Plato through the lens of Badiou, I realize how foreign Plato was in his own day. See, Plato has become such a staple of the Western imagination that most people don't know how to read Plato in a fresh way, to really see the shocking nature of many of the arguments and claims that get put forward in his writings. But in his day, his suggestion that plutocracy, democracy, timocracy, and tyranny were all the wrong way to govern a society. That's all of the governments that existed in his day. I mean, there weren't any other kinds. So he was foreign. He was proposing a model for government that did not exist in his day. He was speaking of strange lands. And I really appreciate that Badiou has helped me to better appreciate the foreignness in Plato's thought and make it fresh again for us today. And the other thing that I would say, just as a more kind of on the ground dimension of reading Plato, is Badiou models, whether or not we ultimately ourselves want to be students of Badiou as a Neoplatonist, that's a different question. What I think he's really good at modeling for us as students of Plato is he took a passage or a series of passages in Plato where Plato has this offhand comment, but he never fleshes it out. He says, unless a chance event creates the coincidence of philosophy and power, we'll never see a just society. Most of us just glide right over that passage without stopping to ask the crucial question. What the heck is an event? What does he mean by a chance event? How do we know when one happened? And Badiou, over a huge series of books, most famously in a book that he wrote in the 80s called Being and Event, that was the title of it, but in many successive works that he's published since then, Badiou was somebody who stopped and said, I'm going to take out the work of fleshing this out, trying to figure out what Plato meant by an event. I'm going to name what an event is. I'm going to talk about why it matters for philosophy. I'm going to give all this detail and lots of examples. That's, I think, a great example of how to be a good reader of Plato. And I hope that will inspire people listening to this episode to ask themselves, what are some other passages in Plato that I just glided right over and I should slow down and really ask myself, what does Plato mean by this? What would it mean to flesh this out? And I know someday down the road in a future Plato's Pod episode, we'll talk about Alfred North Whitehead. He's another example of somebody who did this, where he took a little passage in the Sophist where Plato talks about life and motion. And Whitehead thought to himself, what does that mean? And ended up developing a whole theory of process as a kind of elaboration on Plato. So that's the biggest takeaway I hope people get from hearing these passages out of Badiou's writings. And I hope we'll do maybe another episode on Badiou to flesh this out more. But whether or not we agree with Badiou, I think he really helps us be better readers of Plato.
That's a great point. And I agree with you. Plato can be incredibly subtle in some things because his whole point was to provoke some discourse, provoke that dialectic back and forth. And so he wasn't going to tell us, but he did want to provoke us. And so I guess he provoked Badiou and all of those. So I'm looking forward to more sessions. I think the other interesting thing too is how they bring some historical perspective into it. So there's 2,400 years since Plato wrote. Let's apply some of that to what Plato wrote and see the practice of things and maybe tie it back to what Plato did and kind of understand that, yeah, he was talking about some kind of universal things that exist today as they did back then. So I think that's been really helpful for me as an introduction to Badiou.
You brought up universality. We'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge the way he ended the passage you read, that these truths are universal propositions. That is, propositions addressed to the whole of humanity without exception. And that means two really radical things. The first is what you just alluded to, which is if it's true in Plato's day, it's true for us. A whole of humanity is spatio-temporal, so it covers the whole of human history. But the other lesson here is that if they're addressed to the whole of humanity without exception, that means that truths, Plato's forms, are the ultimate common good. That is the thing that nobody can have private ownership over. They belong to everybody, they are for the benefit of everybody. And if there's anything for philosophy to do today, it's to defend the universality of truth. The followers of Nietzsche and Sartre think they're being liberating by encouraging people to defend my truth and your truth and so on. But they don't realize that that is just continuing the pattern of excluding people from these in-group mentalities, these in-group privileges, these in-group goods. And if a good is not shared, it's not a good. And Plato's great insight is that real truth is for everyone. And that's why it's liberating because nobody is excluded. It's for the whole of humanity without exception.
I agree. And a lot of people don't, because of the circumstances of their life, they don't have, maybe have never stopped to think about universal truths or even ask the question, is there universal truths? And so they tend to follow others in this. And so, yeah, I think this is an appeal to stop and think about where we can make a difference and to see differences. I like the way that you said that it's empowering for the benefit of all. It's one person can get a lot of power by taking benefits away from people. But if we all agree that there are these things out there and they're limitless, infinite, and we can access them, but we have to be a little bit more philosophical and a little bit more together in our approach, I guess. So yeah, very much looking forward to more discussions on Badiou and other Neoplatonists. It's very good to see how Plato from 2,400 years ago affects thinking today. As you say, it fleshes out those very subtle things in Plato, like that example of the square and the diagonal that we talked about earlier. Very relatively subtle reference, but here Badiou is talking about incommensurability all through the whole thing. It's interesting to see how he builds on that. So it's been great talking to you, Michael, and we look forward to more discussions as always. Thank you very much for introducing us to Alain Badiou.
Thank you, James. And once again, people who want more of this can find me at Plato for the Masses on Substack.
Thank you.